My son woke me before sunrise, his voice steady but careful, like he was choosing each word. "Make some coffee," he said. "Set the table." The house was still dark, and I could feel that this morning wasn't meant to pass quietly. We lived in a small, aging house where mornings usually arrived slowly, with the kettle and the radio murmuring together. My son and I had learned to live around certain silences. Old absences we didn't name, habits we didn't question. That morning, as the sky lightened from black to gray, I sensed that something long avoided was finally ready to step into the room with us. My son stood in the doorway of my room when I opened my eyes. He hadn't touched my shoulder or called my name. He just waited, the way he used to when he was small and afraid of storms, counting his breath until I noticed him. "Make some coffee," he said gently, then after a pause, and set the table. He didn't say why. I followed him down the hallway, my feet bare against the cold wood. The light was still off, but dawn had begun pressing faintly against the windows, turning the dark into a thin blue. Shadows stretched along the walls, long and unfamiliar, like the house had rearranged itself while we slept. He was already sitting at the table when I reached the kitchen. Hands folded, back straight, not restless, not nervous, just still. He looked past me, past the cabinets and the sink, and fixed his eyes on the window above the counter, as if something out there might arrive early if he watched hard enough. The kettle felt heavier than usual when I lifted it. The tap groaned softly as the water filled it, a sound I'd heard every morning for years. But this time it landed differently. Everything did. The click of the switch, the tick of the clock. Even my own breathing sounded louder than it should have been. I reached for the cups without thinking and stopped when I realized my hand had taken 3. I stood there a moment, holding them, feeling foolish. Then I set them down anyway. The floor was cold. Cold in a way that crept up slowly, reminding me I'd been standing still too long. I shifted my weight and glanced at my son. He hadn't moved. He didn't look at the cups. Didn't comment. Just sat there, calm as a lake before weather. "You want eggs?" I asked, keeping my voice light. "Ordinary. Just coffee," he said, another pause. "And the table." So I set it. Plates. Napkins. Cutlery placed carefully, like it mattered. I smoothed the cloth, even though it was already flat. Straightened the chair across from his. The empty one. I don't know when that chair started feeling heavier than the others. It had always been there. But that morning, it felt occupied by something invisible. Memory, maybe. Or expectation. The kettle began to whistle. Sharp. Sudden. I turned it down quickly, as if I'd offended the quiet. Steam fogged the window for a moment, then cleared. Outside, the sky had softened to gray, the night loosening its grip. My son finally looked at me then. Not fully. Just a glance, quick and measuring, like he was checking whether I was ready to hear something. Whatever it was. "Do you remember," he said slowly, "how early it used to get light in the winter?" I frowned slightly. "It doesn't," I said. "It gets light later." He nodded. "That's what I thought too." He went quiet again. I poured the coffee. The sound filled the room, rich and grounding. The smell was familiar, comforting. But even that felt like it belonged to another morning. Another life. I sat across from him, the empty chair between us and the window. I tried to catch his eyes, but he kept them lowered now, tracing a small scratch in the table with his thumb. A mark left years ago, maybe by a dropped fork or a careless moment. I'd never noticed it before. "How long have you been awake?" I asked. "Long enough," he said. That answer sat with me. Long enough for what? The clock ticked. Loud. Accusatory. I thought about all the mornings we'd spent in this kitchen, rushed breakfasts, spilled cereal, arguments about shoes and homework. All the afternoons that followed, then evenings, then years. And I wondered how something could live quietly among those memories without me seeing it. "Are we waiting for someone?" I asked finally. He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was steady, but there was something underneath it. Something careful. "We should be," he said. I felt a tightening in my chest, not fear exactly. More like recognition. The kind that comes before you remember something you've tried not to. The light reached the curtains, touching their edges like fingers. Outside, a bird called once. Just once. Then silence again. I thought about the extra cup. The extra place setting. How my hands had known before my mind did. "Is this about?" I started, then stopped. I didn't know how to finish the sentence. Or if I wanted to. He looked up then. Really looked at me. And for a moment, I saw the child he'd been. And the man he was becoming. and something else layered between them. A truth he'd been carrying alone. "Just sit," he said softly. "Please." So I did. We sat there together as the sun finally cleared the horizon, filling the kitchen with pale gold. The house seemed to hold its breath. Every object exactly where it should be. Waiting. I didn't know yet what was coming, but I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that whatever crossed that threshold today would change how I remembered every morning before it. The chair made a sound when I pulled it back. Not loud, just a small scrape against the floor, like it wanted to be noticed. I paused with my hands still on the wood, listening to the echo fade. The house felt awake now, not alive exactly, but aware. As if it understood this morning was different and had decided to pay attention. I reached for another cup without thinking. White ceramic, a thin crack near the handle. The one that had always been pushed to the back of the cabinet. I set it beside the others, then stopped. My hand lingered there longer than it should have. I don't know what unsettled me more, the extra cup, or the fact that my body had chosen it before my mind caught up. The coffee machine hummed, low and steady. A familiar sound meant to comfort. The smell spread through the kitchen, rich and warm, curling into the corners. But the warmth didn't reach me. It stayed in the air, hovering. My chest felt tight, like I'd stepped outside without a coat. My son sat across from me, shoulders relaxed, hands wrapped loosely around his mug. He watched the steam rise as if it were telling him something. He didn't look at me. Not once. His gaze stayed fixed on the space between us, on that empty chair by the window. "Do you remember Pine Hollow?" he asked quietly. The name landed softly, but it landed. I felt it in my throat before I could answer. "We drove through once," I said. "Years ago." He nodded. There was a red mailbox at the end of the road. I stared at him. "I don't remember that." "That's okay," he said. "I do." He lifted his cup, took a small sip, then set it back down untouched. The steam curled around his face, then disappeared. He traced the rim of the mug with one finger, slow and deliberate, like he was buying time. "Mrs. Calder lived there," he went on. "She used to wave when we passed, even when no one waved back." I swallowed. That name. I hadn't heard it in years. Not aloud. It belonged to a place we didn't talk about. A place that existed only in old directions and folded maps. "She had a porch swing," he added. "Paint peeling. Always moving, even when there was no wind." I felt the chair beside me again. Empty. Waiting. The clock ticked behind me, each second loud enough to feel personal. I turned slightly, glancing at the window. Outside, a car crept past the house, slow as if the driver were lost. It moved through the frame, then was gone. The street returned to stillness, like nothing had happened. My son didn't look up. "We don't go there anymore," I said, more to myself than to him. "No," he agreed. "We don't." The coffee maker clicked off. The sudden silence made my shoulders tense. I poured another cup anyway, careful not to spill. The liquid was dark and steady, filling the space I'd made for it. "You don't have to say it all at once," I told him. "You know that." He nodded but didn't respond. Instead, he reached out and adjusted the empty chair slightly, pulling it closer to the table. The legs scraped again. The sound felt deliberate this time. "Do you know," he said slowly, "how long a chair can sit in the same place before it starts to feel like part of the house?" I frowned. "I suppose a long time." "It remembers," he said. "Even if we don't." That's when I understood. Not fully, but enough for my breath to catch. He wasn't telling stories to fill the silence. He was circling something. Something heavy. Something he'd carried longer than I realized. "I found the letters," he said finally. My hand tightened around my cup. "What letters?" "In the box," he said. "The one you keep in the hall closet. Behind the coats." I hadn't opened that box in years. I'd convinced myself it was empty. Or harmless. Or forgotten. "They were still tied with string," he continued. "Neat. Like you meant to come back to them." I felt heat rise behind my eyes, but I didn't let it spill. "Not yet. I didn't read all of them," he said quickly. "Just enough." He glanced at me then. Just once. His eyes weren't angry. They were steady. Searching. "You never threw them away," he said. "That means something." The empty chair seemed closer now. Closer than comfort allowed. I thought about all the times I'd dusted around it. All the times I'd left it untouched when guests came, like it was reserved. I'd never questioned why. "Is that why you wanted the table set?" I asked. He nodded. "For how long?" I whispered. "For years," he said. I just didn't know it until now. Outside, the light shifted. The morning had fully arrived without asking permission. I realized my hands were shaking when I tried to lift my cup again. I didn't know how to bring it up, he said. So I waited. For what? I asked. For today, he replied. We sat in silence after that. Not empty silence. Full. Pressed tight with things that had been waiting longer than either of us. The empty chair caught the light from the window, its worn seat glowing softly. It looked ready, as if it had always known this morning would come. And for the first time, I wondered if the chair had never been empty at all, if it had simply been holding a place, patient and unmoving, until we were brave enough to sit down and tell the truth. The light had changed without me noticing. One moment the kitchen was still blue with early morning. The next it was washed in a thin, honest gold. Dawn has a way of doing that, arriving quietly, then revealing things you didn't know were there. The dust in the air. The faint cracks in the walls. The weight in a room you've been avoiding for years. My son shifted in his chair. Not restless. Just enough to remind me he was there. Still here. Still waiting. The coffee had gone untouched for a while. A thin skin had begun to form on the surface, barely visible, like something fragile you don't want to disturb. I noticed it because my eyes didn't know where else to land. Not on him. Not yet. He cleared his throat once. Soft. Careful. Can I ask you something? He said. It wasn't the question itself that made my stomach tighten. It was the way he asked it. Like someone knocking on a door they already know is unlocked, but are afraid to open. Of course, I said. He didn't speak right away. His fingers rested flat on the table, spread just enough to show he was grounding himself. I recognized that gesture. I'd done the same thing many times, in many places, pretending I was steady when I wasn't. Do you remember? He began, then stopped. He exhaled slowly. Do you remember why we stopped going there? There it was. The shape of it. The place he wouldn't name. The place we'd stepped around in conversation like a loose floorboard. I swallowed. The kitchen felt smaller suddenly, as if the walls had leaned in closer, narrowing the space between us. I thought it was better, I said carefully. At the time. He nodded. Not agreement. Just acknowledgement. Better for who? He asked. The question wasn't sharp. It didn't accuse. That almost made it harder. If he'd raised his voice, I might have defended myself. If he'd cried, I might have rushed to comfort him. But this was something else. Quiet. Measured. Adult. I was trying to protect you, I said. He looked at me then. Really looked. His eyes were calm, but there was something settled in them. Something that told me he'd already walked this path alone. I know, he said. I just didn't know from what. The clock ticked. A long, hollow sound between sentences. I thought about all the nights I'd lain awake rehearsing explanations I'd never given. All the times I'd decided tomorrow wasn't the right day. I traced the edge of my mug with my thumb. The ceramic was warm, but the warmth didn't register. My mind had already drifted backward. I saw the road again. The one we used to take when he was small. How he'd press his face to the window, counting fences, asking the same questions every time. I remembered the way I'd answer vaguely, changing the subject before he noticed my voice tighten. I didn't think you remembered any of it, I admitted. I didn't, he said. Not like this. But some things don't disappear. They just wait. That landed heavier than he probably meant it to. He leaned back slightly, folding his arms, then unfolded them again. Like he couldn't quite decide how to hold himself. When I found the letters, he said, I wasn't looking for answers. Not really. I just wanted to know why some names felt familiar even though I couldn't place them. My chest tightened. I kept my eyes on the table. They weren't angry, he continued. That surprised me. I nodded. They never were. So why didn't you answer them? He asked. The question hovered between us. Gentle. Devastating. I was tired, I said finally. And scared. And convinced that if I stayed quiet long enough, the need would fade. He absorbed that. Didn't interrupt. Didn't correct me. And did it? He asked. I shook my head. No. The truth of that sat heavy in my mouth. Bitter. Familiar. He looked toward the window then, watching the morning move along without us. A neighbor's dog barked somewhere down the street. A door opened. Life continuing unaware. I used to think, he said slowly, that if something was important, people would talk about it. That silence meant it didn't matter. I felt something crack open inside me. Small. Sharp. I know better now, he added. Silence usually means it mattered too much. I closed my eyes briefly. Just long enough to steady myself. I didn't mean to put that on you, I said. Any of it. I know, he said again. And this time it felt like forgiveness. Or at least the beginning of it. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. His voice dropped slightly. Did you ever think I'd find out? He asked. Yes, I said without hesitation. Every day. That surprised him. I could tell by the way his eyebrows lifted just a fraction. Then why? Because knowing something is coming doesn't make it easier to face, I said. Sometimes it just teaches you how to delay. He sat with that. Let it settle. The empty chair beside us caught the light again, brighter now, its worn edges softened by morning. I wondered how many conversations had been waiting in that space. How many chances we'd walked past. I wasn't angry when I read them, he said quietly. Mostly I just wondered how long you'd been carrying it alone. I looked at him then. Really looked. At the man he'd become without answers I should have given. At the steadiness he'd learned on his own. Too long, I said. He nodded. Once. Outside, the day continued to unfold. Inside, something loosened. Not resolved. Not healed. But acknowledged. He took a breath, slow and deliberate. There's more, he said. Things I don't understand yet. I felt the weight of that sentence and the invitation inside it. That's okay, I said. We don't have to say everything today. He met my eyes. Held them. But we've started, he replied. And in that moment, I realized the hardest part wasn't what we'd never said. It was knowing that the silence had been speaking all along, and that now, finally, we were listening. The knock was so soft I almost missed it. Not the kind of knock meant to announce arrival, more like a question asked by knuckles against wood. The house answered before I did. A small shudder through the floor. A tightening in my chest. I knew that sound, even after all these years. My heart reacted first, beating faster, then slower, like it was trying to decide whether to run or stand still. I didn't move right away. I stood there in the kitchen, my hand resting on the back of the empty chair, feeling the grain of the wood under my palm. The clock ticked once. Twice. My son looked up, calm as ever, and nodded toward the door without a word. Not surprised. Not startled. Just ready. Each step toward the hallway felt louder than it should have been. The floor creaked like it remembered every time I'd crossed it in a hurry. Every night I'd paced with a worry I couldn't name. Morning light followed me down the hall, thin and pale, stretching my shadow along the wall. I could feel the house watching. Waiting. The second knock came, gentler than the first. As if the person on the other side had already decided to leave. I reached the door and paused, my fingers hovering near the handle. I thought about all the times I'd imagined this moment, and how none of those versions matched the weight of it now. I took a breath. It didn't help. When I opened the door, the morning air rushed in, cold and sharp, smelling faintly of damp leaves in the road. It brushed past me, into the hallway, like it was reclaiming something. He stood there with his hands at his sides. No coat. No bag. Just a face I knew too well, altered by time but unmistakable. The lines around his eyes were deeper. His hair thinner, threaded with gray. But the way he held himself, still slightly hunched, as if expecting to be turned away, hadn't changed at all. For a moment, none of us spoke. He looked at me, then past me, his eyes landing briefly on the kitchen behind me. On the table. On the chair pulled close. Something flickered across his face, recognition maybe. Or relief. Morning, he said quietly. I nodded. That was all I trusted myself to do. He shifted his weight, scuffing the toe of his shoe against the step. I wasn't sure if. It's okay, I said, though I wasn't sure what I meant by that. Okay that he was here. Okay that he'd waited this long. Okay that the silence had finally broken. Behind me, I felt my son move closer. He stopped a few feet away, just inside the doorway. I didn't have to look to know he was there. I could feel the steadiness of him, like a hand at my back. You can come in, I said. He hesitated, then stepped over the threshold. The door closed softly behind him, sealing the three of us inside with a sound that felt final. The hallway seemed smaller with him in it, narrower somehow, as if it had been holding its breath all these years and had finally let it out. He glanced around, taking in the familiar things made unfamiliar by time. The coat rack. The framed photo on the wall. The small crack near the baseboard I'd meant to fix for years. His eyes lingered there, like he was counting proof that life had gone on without him. I didn't know if this was still the right house, he said. But the porch light. I never changed it, I replied. He smiled at that. Just a little. Not with his eyes. We moved back toward the kitchen, slowly, like we were afraid of making the wrong turn. When he saw the table fully set, his steps faltered. "You remembered," he said. My son spoke then, his voice even. "We were waiting." The man's breath caught. He looked at my son properly for the first time. Studied his face. The shape of his mouth. The set of his jaw. Things he might have recognized if he'd allowed himself to look sooner. "You've grown," he said. "I know," my son replied. Not unkind. Just true. We sat. The empty chair was no longer empty. He took it carefully, as if it might disappear if he moved too fast. I poured fresh coffee without asking. My hands shook a little, but not enough to spill. No one rushed the moment. The cup steamed. The light brightened. Outside, a car passed, then another. Ordinary sounds carrying on, unaware of the small reckoning happening inside our kitchen. "I didn't plan to come like this," he said eventually. I heard about the letters. I felt my son's eyes on me, but I kept mine on the table. "I should have come sooner," he added. "I should have said something." "Yes," I said softly. "You should have." He nodded, accepting it without defense. That mattered more than any explanation. "I didn't know how," he said. And then time made it harder. Time always does. My son leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. "How long have you known you were coming?" he asked. The man looked at him, then at me. "Long enough," he said. I realized then that my son had known too. Known this day was coming. That he'd set the table not for hope, but for truth. We sat there, the three of us, with the morning fully settled around us. Nothing resolved. Nothing forgiven yet. But something acknowledged. The coffee cooled. The light softened. And as I watched the man across from me lift his cup with unsteady hands, I understood that the hardest part wasn't opening the door. It was what came after. What we chose to say now that it was open, and what would happen if we didn't. The coffee had cooled by the time we all sat down. Not cold, just past the point where steam rose and promised comfort. The light was fully in the room now, honest and unafraid, laying itself across the table, the floor, the small cracks in the walls we'd learned to step around. Morning had arrived without asking if we were ready. We sat close, knees nearly touching. No one reached for their cup right away. The spoons rested where they'd been left, catching the light and giving it back in small flashes. Outside, a bird landed on the fence, then took off again. Ordinary things continued. That felt important. I looked at my son first. He sat straight, shoulders relaxed, hands open on the table. Not braced. Not defensive. Just present. I realized then he hadn't asked for coffee because he was tired. He'd asked because he wanted a record of this moment. A witness. Something warm to hold while truth took its shape. "I don't want this to be loud," he said quietly. "I just want it to be clear." The man across from us nodded. He kept his eyes on the table, on the grain of the wood, like it might help him stay grounded. His hands wrapped around his cup, even though it no longer warmed them. "I left because I believed something that wasn't true," he said. Simple. No build-up. No defense. And because I didn't trust myself enough to question it. I felt my breath catch, but I stayed still. "What did you believe?" my son asked. "That I was doing more harm by staying," he replied. That distance would soften things. That time would explain what I couldn't. Time doesn't explain anything. It only waits. "And when did you realize you were wrong?" I asked. He lifted his head then. Looked at me fully. His eyes were tired but clear. "When the silence stopped feeling protective," he said. "When it started feeling like a lie." My son nodded once, as if confirming something he'd already suspected. "I used to think," my son said, "that people disappear because they don't care. That if someone loved you, they'd find a way to stay." The man swallowed. "I did care," he said. "I just didn't know how to stay without breaking what was already fragile." That sentence settled between us. Not as an excuse. As an offering. I thought of all the years I'd carried my version of the story alone. How it had hardened in places, softened in others. How I'd repeated it so often it had begun to sound like truth. "I believed you left because you chose to," I said. "Because choosing to go was easier than choosing to face what we'd lost." He nodded. "I let you believe that. That was the hardest part. Not the leaving. The allowing." My son leaned back slightly, exhaling. "So this is what happened," he said, not accusing. "Naming. One person left to avoid causing pain. Another stayed and carried the weight of that absence. And I grew up inside the space neither of you filled with words." The room went quiet. Not tense. Just still. "I'm sorry," the man said. Not loudly. Not desperately. Just once. Like he knew better than to overuse it. I know, my son replied. And for the first time that morning, he reached for his cup and took a sip. The sound of it, small, ordinary, felt like permission. I followed. The coffee was lukewarm, but it grounded me. Brought me back into my body. We were all wrong about something, I said finally. And we all paid for it. No one argued. The light shifted again, climbing higher on the wall. Dust motes floated lazily in it, unbothered by our history. The table creaked softly when the man shifted in his chair, like it was adjusting to its new purpose. I didn't come to fix everything, he said. I just didn't want to keep pretending it never mattered. My son studied him for a moment, then nodded. That's enough for today. Enough. Not everything, but enough. We sat there longer than necessary, letting the words settle where they landed. There was no sudden relief. No rush of forgiveness. Just the quiet recognition that the truth, once named, didn't need to shout to be real. I realized then that this morning wasn't about reopening wounds. It was about stopping the bleeding we'd learned to live with. Outside, the day moved on. A neighbor started their car. Somewhere, a door slammed. Life continuing its steady rhythm. My son stood first. He gathered the cups, one by one, carrying them to the sink. The clink of ceramic was gentle, careful. He rinsed them without hurry, then set them upside down on the towel. When he turned back to us, his expression was lighter. Not healed, but unburdened in a way I hadn't seen before. We can talk more later, he said. If we want to. I met his eyes and nodded. We will. The man stood too, uncertain, like he wasn't sure where to place himself now that the truth had been spoken. I watched him take in the room again, not as a stranger this time, but not fully as family either. We'll figure out what comes next, I said. And for the first time, I believed it. He gave a small smile. Not with his eyes, but closer than before. As they moved toward the door together, the table stood behind them, quiet and ordinary again. No longer waiting. No longer empty. I stayed where I was, one hand resting on the back of my chair, feeling the warmth the room had finally allowed to reach me. This morning hadn't ended anything. It had only given us a place to begin, one we'd avoided for years, and one we were finally brave enough to sit at together.